Rachel Blackwood had been invisible at Hartwell Defense Textiles for 7 months, and that's exactly how she preferred it. Every morning at 6 a.m., she'd slip through the employee entrance in her plain navy work shirt and dark jeans, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail as she walked to her station on the production floor. The supervisors barely acknowledged her anymore. Just another seamstress doing the detail work nobody else wanted to handle. But what they didn't know was that Rachel's hands, which they saw carefully stitching tactical vests and military uniforms, had once assembled weapons faster than most people could blink. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. At 28, Rachel had perfected the art of blending into the industrial landscape of Hartwell Defense Textiles. The company specialized in manufacturing military uniforms, tactical gear, and protective equipment for defense contractors across the western United States. Located in Denver's industrial district, the facility hummed with the constant rhythm of industrial sewing machines, cutting tables, and quality control stations. Morning stitches, Floor Supervisor Marcus Donovan would call out with his usual smirk, not bothering to learn her actual name despite her 7 months of flawless work. Marcus was a man who enjoyed the small power his position afforded him, especially over the civilian contractors who made up most of the production staff. At 42, he'd worked his way up from the factory floor through a combination of persistence and an ability to make himself indispensable to upper management. What he lacked in technical expertise, he made up for with an encyclopedic knowledge of company politics and an instinct for identifying who could be pushed around. Rachel would nod politely and continue to her workstation, where she spent her days creating precise stitching patterns on ballistic vests, tactical pouches, and uniform components. Her work was always perfect, not just good, but flawless in a way that spoke of deeper understanding than mere technical skill. While other seamstresses occasionally had to rip out seams and start over, Rachel's work never required correction. Her measurements were exact, her stitching patterns optimal for both durability and functionality, but Rachel carried secrets in her methodical movements. When she thought no one was watching, she'd run her fingers along the tactical webbing with the familiarity of someone who'd worn it in life or death situations. She'd unconsciously check the stress points on ballistic vests, testing them with the critical eye of someone who understood that shoddy work could cost lives. Her eyes would linger on the specification sheets for military contracts, and she'd notice errors that others missed: incorrect thread weights, improper stitch densities, or placement issues that would affect functionality in the field. Staff Sergeant William Blackwood had been a legend in Army ordnance circles, the kind of soldier other soldiers told stories about in hushed, respectful tones. He'd trained Rachel from age 14 until his death in an IED explosion in Afghanistan when she was 22. But that was 6 years ago, and now she was just another face in the crowd, invisible and unremarkable, content to honor her father's memory through quiet excellence rather than recognition. The first hints of Rachel's true capabilities came in small moments that most people dismissed. When new employee David Kim struggled with the proper tension settings on his industrial sewing machine, Rachel quietly adjusted it during her break, leaving a small note explaining the optimal settings for different fabric weights. When a batch of tactical vests came back from quality control with complaints about inadequate reinforcement, Rachel had already identified the problem: incorrect thread weight that would fail under stress. But she kept her observations to herself. The production floor at Hartwell was a carefully orchestrated dance of specialization. Each worker had their assigned tasks: cutting patterns, operating specific machines, quality control checks, and final assembly. Rachel worked in the detail section, responsible for the precise stitching work that required the steadiest hands and the most attention to detail. It was considered entry-level work, But Rachel approached it with the intensity of someone who understood that every stitch could matter in combat situations. Marcus Donovan seemed to take particular pleasure in making Rachel's assignments as tedious as possible. While other workers rotated between different tasks to break the monotony, he kept Rachel locked into the most repetitive work. "Stick to what you're good at, Stitches," he'd say whenever she showed interest in other aspects of production. Detail. Work is about all civilian contractors can handle reliably. What Marcus didn't understand was that Rachel was learning everything. During her breaks, she'd walk through different sections of the facility, observing the cutting processes, the pattern making, the quality control procedures. She studied the technical specifications for military contracts, noting the exact requirements for different types of gear. She absorbed information about materials, stress testing, and military standards with the focus of someone who'd been trained to understand that knowledge could be the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Plant manager Catherine Walsh had begun to notice Rachel's dedication. Unlike Marcus, Catherine had actually read the personnel files of her employees. Rachel's application had been straightforward: previous experience in textile work, excellent references, seeking stable employment. But there was something about her focus, her attention to detail, that went beyond what you'd expect from someone just looking for a paycheck. Catherine was a retired Air Force colonel who'd taken the civilian job after her military retirement. She understood the importance of recognizing talent wherever it appeared, and she'd learned to look beyond surface appearances. There was something about Rachel's bearing, the way she carried herself, that reminded Catherine of military personnel. Not obvious. Rachel was clearly trying to blend in, but there were subtle signs: the way she kept her workspace organized, the unconscious attention to detail that went beyond job requirements, the quiet respect she showed for the military gear they produced. The other seamstresses had mixed reactions to Rachel. Some appreciated her willingness to help when they encountered problems. Others found her intensity somewhat intimidating. Nina Vasquez, who worked at the adjacent station, had tried to engage Rachel in the usual workplace gossip, but Rachel remained politely distant. She was friendly enough, but there was a reserve there, as if she was holding back significant parts of herself. "She's weird," Nina had confided to fellow worker Brandon Park during their lunch break. "Nice enough, but it's like she's always thinking about something else. Like this job isn't really what she's meant to be doing." Brandon, who'd been working at Hartwell for 3 years, had his own observations. "I don't know about weird, but she definitely knows more than she lets on. Last week, I was struggling with a pattern adjustment, and she glanced over and immediately spotted what I was doing wrong. Didn't make a big deal about it, just quietly showed me the fix. But the way she understood the problem, that wasn't beginner-level knowledge." Rachel was aware of the speculation but didn't engage with it. She'd learned the hard way that standing out could be dangerous, that sometimes the best way to serve was to remain unnoticed. Her father had taught her that excellence didn't require an audience, that doing the job right was more important than getting credit for doing the job right. The routine of the textile plant suited Rachel's need for structure and purpose. Each day brought the same challenges: maintaining perfect quality standards, meeting production quotas, contributing to the creation of gear that would protect soldiers in the field. It wasn't the same as her previous life, but it allowed her to stay connected to the military community in a way that felt meaningful without being overwhelming. As she worked at her station that crisp October morning, carefully stitching reinforcement patterns onto a tactical vest, Rachel had no idea that within weeks, her careful anonymity would be shattered by circumstances that would force her to reveal capabilities she'd been hiding for 7 months. The quiet seamstress who'd perfected the art of being invisible was about to become the most important person in the facility. The military contract evaluation that would change everything was already scheduled. The crisis that would demand her expertise was already approaching. And Marcus Donovan's systematic underestimation of her abilities was about to become the most expensive mistake of his career. But for now, Rachel continued her work in peaceful anonymity, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd been trained by a master, carrying her father's legacy in the perfection of every stitch. The secrets Rachel carried went deeper than perfect stitching patterns. Staff Sergeant William Blackwood hadn't just been any Army ordnance specialist. He'd been a master armorer, weapons systems expert, and tactical instructor whose reputation had reached legendary status among special operations units. For 8 years, from Rachel's 14th birthday until she enlisted at 22, he'd trained her in skills that went far beyond what any civilian would ever need to know. Rachel's apartment, a modest one-bedroom 15 minutes from the Hartwell facility, told the story of a life carefully compartmentalized. To any casual visitor, it looked like the home of a dedicated seamstress, neat, organized with a small workspace for personal sewing projects. But hidden in a locked closet were reminders of her true heritage, her father's service decorations, technical manuals on weapon systems, and photographs from her own military service that she'd ended abruptly after his death. The mornings before work were Rachel's most dangerous time, when muscle memory threatened to betray her carefully constructed civilian identity. As she made coffee, her hands would unconsciously go through the motions of weapons checks, phantom movements left over from years of military routine. She'd catch herself and force her hands to focus on mundane tasks, stirring cream, checking her work schedule, anything to override the trained responses that had once been second nature. At Hartwell, these ingrained behaviors manifested in subtle ways that most people missed. When Rachel examined tactical gear, her assessment went far beyond the stitching quality. She'd unconsciously check attachment points for proper load distribution, test the durability of fasteners with the critical eye of someone who'd seen gear fail in combat, and note design flaws that could compromise functionality in the field. Her father had trained her to see equipment as systems, not just products, and that perspective shaped everything she touched. David Kim, the young worker whose sewing machine Rachel had quietly fixed, had begun to notice her unusual attention to detail. During their shared lunch breaks, he'd observed how she studied the military specification sheets with an intensity that seemed unusual for someone whose job was just stitching. When quality control rejected a batch of tactical pouches for dimensional inconsistencies, Rachel had examined the rejected items and immediately identified the root cause: a calibration error in the cutting equipment that was producing variations too small for most people to notice, but significant enough to affect functionality. "How did you spot that so quickly?" David had asked, genuinely curious. Rachel had looked up, realizing she'd revealed more expertise than intended. "Just experience with precision work," she'd said carefully. "Details matter more than people think." But David had noticed the way she'd handled the tactical pouches, not like someone examining a sewing project, but like someone who'd used similar equipment in situations where reliability mattered. There was familiarity in her movements, knowledge that went beyond textile manufacturing. Catherine Walsh had her own growing suspicions about Rachel's background. During a routine walk through the production floor, she'd observed Rachel examining a damaged ballistic vest with the systematic approach of someone conducting a forensic analysis. Rachel had been documenting the failure points, noting stress patterns and material degradation with technical precision that exceeded what any textile worker would need to know. "Interesting assessment," Catherine had commented, approaching Rachel's workstation. Rachel had looked up, momentarily startled. "Just trying to understand why it failed, ma'am. Better quality control, you know." But Catherine had seen the documentation. Rachel was creating detailed diagrams with technical annotations that demonstrated knowledge of ballistics, impact dynamics, and material science. This wasn't curiosity. This was expertise. Marcus Donovan remained oblivious to the undercurrents surrounding Rachel. To him, she was still just stitches, the civilian contractor who did what she was told without complaint. He'd assigned her increasingly menial tasks, partly from spite and partly from his own insecurity about workers who seemed more competent than their position suggested. What Marcus didn't understand was that Rachel's willingness to accept difficult assignments without complaint wasn't submissiveness, it was discipline. The discipline showed in everything Rachel did. Her workspace was organized with military precision. Her tools were maintained to higher standards than anyone else's. Her production quality was consistently perfect, not just good. When equipment malfunctioned, she could often diagnose and fix problems that left other workers stumped. But she did all of this quietly, without drawing attention to herself. Rachel's true expertise became most apparent when technical problems arose. When a shipment of ballistic panels arrived with questionable certifications, other workers accepted them as meeting specifications. Rachel had noticed subtle differences in the weave pattern that indicated potential weaknesses. She'd kept her observations to herself, but documented everything in a personal notebook that she carried discreetly. The notebook was Rachel's way of staying connected to her father's teachings without revealing her background. Each day, she recorded observations about materials, manufacturing processes, quality issues, and design improvements. To anyone else, it would look like the notes of a dedicated employee. But Rachel was actually conducting the kind of systematic analysis her father had trained her to perform on military equipment. Brandon Park had started paying attention to Rachel after the pattern adjustment incident. During break conversations, he'd tested her knowledge with casual questions about different aspects of textile work. Her answers consistently demonstrated understanding that went beyond her apparent experience level. When he'd asked about thread tension calculations for different fabric weights, she'd given him a formula that he later discovered was used in aerospace manufacturing. "Where did you learn about stress calculations?" he'd asked. "Online research," Rachel had replied simply. "I like to understand how things work." But Brandon had noticed that her research seemed to cover an unusually broad range of technical subjects. She knew about material science, manufacturing tolerances, quality control procedures, and design principles that seemed more appropriate for an engineer than a seamstress. The most revealing incident had occurred during a visit from a military procurement officer who was inspecting a contract fulfillment. As the officer examined finished products, Rachel had observed from a distance, and her body language had changed. She'd stood straighter, her attention had become more focused, and she'd unconsciously adopted the bearing of someone accustomed to military protocols. Catherine had noticed the transformation and filed it away as another piece of the puzzle. Rachel's evenings were spent maintaining the skills her father had taught her, though she'd had to be creative about practice opportunities. She'd found a private shooting range an hour outside Denver where she could maintain her marksmanship without attracting attention. The range owner, a retired Marine, had been impressed by her expertise, but hadn't asked uncomfortable questions. For Rachel, these sessions weren't about nostalgia. They were about honoring her father's memory by maintaining the standards he'd instilled in her. The physical conditioning was harder to maintain secretly. Rachel had converted her apartment's spare room into a compact gym, focusing on the functional fitness her father had emphasized. Strength, endurance, and flexibility weren't just about personal health. They were about maintaining capability for situations that required physical demands beyond normal civilian life. As October progressed, Rachel found herself thinking more often about her father's lessons. He'd taught her that expertise carried responsibility, that knowledge unused when it could help others was a form of selfishness. But he'd also taught her about timing, about waiting for the right moment to reveal capabilities that could change everything. That moment was approaching faster than Rachel knew. The military contract evaluation that would test Hartwell's capabilities was only weeks away. Quality control issues were mounting, And Marcus Donovan's systematic underestimation of his workers was about to create a crisis that would demand exactly the kind of expertise Rachel had been hiding. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Readiness isn't about feeling prepared, Rachel. It's about being prepared to act when the situation demands it. She just hadn't expected that situation to arise in a textile factory in Denver, surrounded by people who saw her as nothing more than a seamstress with unusually steady hands. The harassment started subtly, but grew with the persistence of a slow-burning fuse. It began with Marcus Donovan's increasingly pointed comments about Rachel's work pace. Despite her consistently meeting all production quotas, "Stitches, you're moving like you're embroidering a wedding dress," he'd call out across the production floor, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is military gear, not arts and crafts." Rachel would continue her work without responding, but the other workers noticed the unfairness. Her quality was flawless, her output met standards, and she never complained about overtime or difficult assignments. The harassment seemed motivated by something beyond legitimate workplace concerns. Marcus had developed a particular routine of humiliation. Every morning at 7:30, he'd conduct what he called quality spot checks, but these inspections focused disproportionately on Rachel's work. He'd examine her stitching with exaggerated scrutiny, holding items up to the light, checking measurements with digital calipers, searching for flaws that didn't exist. "Tension's a bit tight on this seam," he'd announce, though the stitching was perfect. "Redo it." Rachel would nod silently and comply, even when she knew the work met or exceeded specifications. Her father had taught her that picking unnecessary battles was a luxury soldiers couldn't afford. Sometimes endurance was more important than being right. The systematic targeting escalated over the following weeks. Marcus began assigning Rachel tasks that seemed designed to waste her skills. While other workers rotated between different types of projects, he kept her locked into the most repetitive, mind-numbing work available. When a rush order came in for specialized tactical gear that required advanced stitching techniques, he assigned it to less experienced workers, while giving Rachel basic hemming work on standard uniforms. "Can't have civilians getting above their station," he'd mutter to his supervisor cronies, loud enough for Rachel to overhear. "Give them complex work, and they start thinking they're indispensable." What Marcus didn't realize was that Rachel was using the repetitive assignments as cover for observation and learning. While her hands performed routine stitching, her mind cataloged everything happening around her. She studied workflow inefficiencies, noted quality control problems, and identified process improvements that could save time and reduce defects. Her father had trained her to see every situation as a learning opportunity. The psychological pressure intensified when Marcus began questioning Rachel's work methods in front of other employees. During a particularly busy afternoon, he'd stopped at her station and loudly proclaimed, "This isn't how we do things here, Stitches. Just because something works doesn't mean it's the right way." Rachel had been using a stitching technique that produced superior results in less time, a method her military training had taught her for field repairs. But explaining that would require revealing knowledge she couldn't afford to share. "Of course, sir. I'll adjust my approach," she'd replied calmly. David Kim, working at the adjacent station, had witnessed the exchange with growing frustration. "She wasn't doing anything wrong," he'd whispered to Nina Vasquez. "Her work is better than anyone else's here." Nina had noticed the pattern too. "Marcus has it out for her. Don't know why, but he's being a real jerk about it." The workplace culture at Hartwell was generally supportive, but Marcus's position gave him significant power over daily operations. Other workers sympathized with Rachel, but were reluctant to challenge a supervisor who could affect their own job security. Rachel understood their position and didn't expect them to risk their livelihoods defending her. Catherine Walsh had begun paying closer attention to the dynamics on the production floor. As a former military officer, she recognized bullying behavior. When she saw it, and Marcus's treatment of Rachel was textbook workplace harassment. During her regular walkthroughs, she'd observed the one-sided nature of his quality checks and the way he seemed to single out Rachel for criticism while ignoring similar or worse work from other employees. "Marcus," she'd said during a private meeting, "I've noticed you're spending a lot of supervisory time on Rachel Blackwood's work. Is there a specific performance issue I should be aware of?" Marcus had straightened defensively. "Just maintaining standards, ma'am. Some workers need closer supervision. Her production numbers and quality metrics are among the best in the department," Catherine had pointed out. "What specific issues are you addressing?" Marcus had struggled to provide concrete examples. "It's more about attitude, work habits, making sure civilian contractors understand their place in the operation." Catherine had made notes about the conversation. As a former colonel, she'd dealt with her share of supervisors who let small amounts of authority go to their heads. Marcus's behavior toward Rachel seemed personal rather than professional. The harassment reached new levels when Marcus implemented what he called enhanced quality protocols that applied only to Rachel's work. Every item she completed had to be re-inspected by a secondary supervisor, causing delays in the production line and implying that her work couldn't be trusted. Other workers noticed the discriminatory treatment, but felt powerless to intervene. "It's not right," Brandon Park had confided to David during lunch. "She does better work than most of us, and he's treating her like she's incompetent." Rachel maintained her professional demeanor through it all, but the constant scrutiny was taking its toll. Not because she doubted her abilities, she knew her work was excellent, but because the injustice reminded her of why she'd left military service. After her father's death, she'd encountered officers who questioned whether emotional trauma had affected her capabilities. The constant evaluation and doubt had become unbearable. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon when Marcus rejected an entire day's work over what he claimed were dimensional inconsistencies. Rachel's measurements were perfect. She'd checked them multiple times, but Marcus had used different calipers that were slightly miscalibrated. Instead of acknowledging the equipment error, he'd made Rachel redo 8 hours of flawless work. "Standards are standards, Stitches," he'd said with obvious satisfaction. "Maybe this will teach you to be more careful." Rachel had worked until 9 p.m. to complete the replacement work, missing her usual evening routine and the stress relief shooting practice provided. As she finally left the facility, she'd felt something hardening inside her chest. Not anger, her father had taught her to channel anger into focus, but determination. That weekend, Rachel spent extra time at the shooting range, working through complex drills that required the kind of precision and timing she'd learned in military service. As she worked, she thought about her father's teachings on endurance and strategic patience. Sometimes the best response to provocation is to become so excellent that denial becomes impossible. He'd told her Marcus Donovan thought he was wearing down a civilian contractor who would eventually quit or accept permanent subjugation. What he didn't understand was that he was challenging someone who'd been trained by one of the Army's finest, someone who'd learned to endure far worse pressure in far more dangerous circumstances. Rachel returned to work Monday morning with renewed focus. If Marcus wanted to test her limits, she'd show him what military-grade persistence looked like. The harassment would continue, but Rachel was no longer just enduring it. She was preparing for the moment when she could demonstrate exactly what he'd been underestimating for 7 months. That her father's voice whispered in her memory, "Excellence is the best revenge, Rachel. Not because it hurts your enemies, but because it proves your worth beyond any doubt." The reckoning was coming, and Marcus Donovan had no idea what storm he'd been feeding with his systematic cruelty. The moment that would begin unraveling Rachel's carefully maintained anonymity came on a Tuesday morning when she arrived to find chaos on the production floor. A critical shipment of ballistic vests had failed military inspection due to what The rejection notice called catastrophic structural weakness in load-bearing components. The entire order worth $200,000 was being returned, and the military contract was in jeopardy. Marcus stood in the center of the commotion, his face flushed with panic as he barked orders at confused workers. "I want every vest re-examined. Find out what went wrong. This is unacceptable." Rachel observed from her station as Quality Control Supervisor James Patterson spread rejected vests across examination tables. The military inspector's report cited failure of critical stitching at stress concentration points under ballistic impact simulation. Workers gathered around, trying to understand how their seemingly perfect work had failed such a spectacular fashion. "The stitching looks fine to me," Nina Vasquez said, examining one of the rejected vests. "I don't see any obvious problems." "Military standards are different than what we're used to," Patterson replied, clearly frustrated. "But I can't figure out exactly what they're seeing that we missed." Rachel watched the discussion with growing recognition. She could see the problem immediately. It wasn't visible defects, but rather a fundamental misunderstanding of how ballistic impacts affected stitching patterns. The thread placement was technically correct, according to textile standards, but wrong for the specific physics of ballistic protection. Her father had spent hours teaching her about the unique stresses that protective gear faced in combat situations. David Kim noticed Rachel's intense focus on the rejected vests. "What do you think, Rachel? You always spot things others miss." Rachel hesitated. Revealing her knowledge would raise questions she wasn't prepared to answer. But the rejected vests represented more than just a business loss. They represented protective gear that would fail soldiers when they needed it most. Her father's lessons about responsibility echoed in her mind. "May I examine one of the vests?" she asked quietly. Marcus whirled around, his frustration seeking a target. "This is a technical evaluation. Stitches. We need qualified personnel, not civilian contractors with opinions." But Catherine Walsh, who had arrived to assess the crisis, overheard the exchange. "Let her look," she said firmly. "At this point, we need all the insight we can get." Rachel approached the examination table with deliberate calm, though her heart was racing. The moment she touched the vest, years of training took over. Her hands moved across the surface with systematic precision, checking attachment points, stress distributions, and stitching patterns with the expertise of someone who'd learned to evaluate equipment when lives depended on accuracy. "The thread pattern is wrong," she said after less than 30 seconds of examination. Marcus scoffed. "Wrong how? Those vests were made exactly to specification." Rachel pointed to the shoulder attachment points. "The stitching follows textile industry standards, but ballistic vests experience different stress loads than regular clothing. Under impact, the energy distributes through these connection points in a way that creates shear forces perpendicular to the thread direction." Production floor fell silent. This wasn't the vocabulary of a seamstress. This was technical analysis that demonstrated deep understanding of ballistics and material science. "What are you saying?" Patterson asked, his frustration replaced by curiosity. Rachel took a breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. "The thread pattern needs to be oriented at a 45-degree angle to the stress lines, with reinforcement stitching in a crosshatch pattern at attachment points. The current straight line approach creates weak points that fail under the rapid energy transfer of ballistic impact." She demonstrated her point by showing how the rejected stitching had pulled apart under stress, then sketched a diagram showing the correct thread orientation for optimal strength distribution. Her drawing included technical details about thread tension, stitch density, and material behavior that nobody on the production floor should have known. Catherine stared at Rachel's diagram with growing amazement. This wasn't guesswork or intuition. This was expert-level knowledge of military equipment engineering. "Where did you learn this?" Catherine asked directly. Rachel felt the weight of 7 months of careful anonymity crashing down around her. Everyone on the production floor was staring at her, waiting for an explanation that would either reveal her secrets or force her to lie convincingly. "Research," she said carefully. "I wanted to understand why some designs work better than others." But Catherine wasn't satisfied with that answer. As a former Air Force colonel, she recognized expertise when she saw it. Rachel's analysis was too sophisticated, too specific, too accurate to have come from casual research. This was knowledge gained through extensive training and practical experience. Marcus, sensing that Rachel's display of knowledge somehow threatened his authority, moved to reassert control. "Even if she's right about the technical issue, she's still just a civilian contractor. This is above her pay grade." "Her pay grade just saved us a $200,000 contract," Catherine replied coolly, "and potentially prevented defective protective gear from reaching soldiers in the field." Rachel realized that her moment of revelation had created a new dynamic on the production floor. Workers who had seen her as just another seamstress were now looking at her with respect and curiosity. David Kim was studying her with obvious amazement. Even Nina Vasquez, who had been friendly but dismissive, was reassessing her assumptions about Rachel's capabilities. "Can you fix the design?" Patterson asked. "I mean, can you show us exactly how the stitching should be done to meet military standards?" Rachel nodded, knowing that there was no going back now. "Yes, but it will require modifying our current procedures and retraining workers on the specific techniques for ballistic applications." Over the next 2 hours, Rachel guided the team through a complete revision of their ballistic vest production process. She demonstrated proper stitching techniques, explained the physics behind each modification, and provided detailed specifications that addressed every issue raised in the military rejection report. Her knowledge was comprehensive and practical, the kind of expertise that came from years of working with military equipment in real-world applications. Marcus watched the transformation with growing alarm. His systematic harassment of Rachel had been based on the assumption that she was just another expendable civilian contractor. Now she was revealing capabilities that made her indispensable to the operation, and his own lack of technical knowledge was becoming glaringly apparent by comparison. "I want a full report on how this design flaw made it through our quality control process," he announced, trying to regain authority. "Someone should have caught this before production." "The flaw wasn't in our quality control," Catherine replied, studying Rachel's documentation. "Our procedures were based on textile industry standards, not military applications. We needed someone with expertise in both areas to identify the disconnect." As the crisis meeting concluded, Rachel felt the familiar weight of visibility settling on her shoulders. For 7 months, she'd successfully maintained her anonymity, contributing quietly while avoiding the scrutiny that came with recognition. But the ballistic vest crisis had forced her to reveal knowledge that couldn't be explained away as casual research or lucky guessing. David Kim approached her as workers began returning to their stations. "That was incredible, Rachel. I had no idea you knew so much about military equipment." Rachel managed a small smile. "Sometimes you pick up things along the way." But she knew that Catherine Walsh wouldn't be satisfied with vague explanations. The plant manager was already making notes, and her expression suggested that she intended to have a much more detailed conversation about Rachel's background. The careful anonymity that had protected Rachel for 7 months was beginning to crumble, and she wasn't sure whether that was a blessing or a catastrophe waiting to happen. Her father had taught her that expertise carried responsibility, but he'd also warned her that visibility could be dangerous. As she returned to her workstation, Rachel wondered if saving the military contract would ultimately cost her the peaceful invisibility she'd worked so hard to maintain. The aftermath of the ballistic vest crisis created an uncomfortable spotlight on Rachel that she'd spent 7 months carefully avoiding. Word of her technical expertise spread through the facility with the speed of industrial gossip, transforming her from invisible seamstress to the subject of whispered speculation and sideways glances. Marcus Donovan's response to Rachel's sudden prominence was swift and vindictive. If he couldn't maintain his authority through competence, he'd reassert it through the raw exercise of supervisory power. The morning after the crisis, he implemented what he called enhanced oversight protocols, specifically targeting Rachel's work. "Since you seem to think you know better than established procedures," he announced during the morning briefing, his voice carrying across the production floor, "we'll be implementing additional quality controls to ensure civilian contractors don't exceed their assigned responsibilities." The new protocols were designed to humiliate. Every task Rachel completed required approval from 3 different supervisors before moving to the next stage. Her workspace was inspected hourly for compliance with standard operating procedures. Most degrading of all, Marcus instituted a rule requiring Rachel to submit written justification for any technique that deviated from the basic methods outlined in the employee handbook. "Can't have civilians making independent decisions about military contracts," Marcus explained to anyone who would listen. "Yesterday's situation was a fluke. We need to maintain proper chains of authority." But the enhanced oversight had an unintended consequence. The constant scrutiny meant that other workers witnessed Rachel's consistent excellence under pressure. Every inspection revealed flawless workmanship. Every technique she used proved more efficient than standard methods. Every suggestion she made, when finally implemented, improved overall production quality. David Kim had started keeping informal notes about the harassment, documenting the disparity between Marcus's treatment of Rachel and his supervision of other workers. "It's getting ridiculous," he confided to Brandon Park during lunch. "She solved a problem that could have cost us a major contract, and now she's being treated like a security risk." The pressure on Rachel intensified when Marcus began assigning her deliberately impossible tasks. When a rush order came in for specialized tactical gear requiring techniques that weren't covered in standard training, he gave Rachel the most complex components while setting unrealistic deadlines. "Let's see how well your research serves you with real-world applications." "Stitches," he'd said with obvious satisfaction. What Marcus didn't anticipate was that Rachel's military training had prepared her for exactly these kinds of challenges. Her father had taught her to work under extreme time pressure, often in conditions far more difficult than anything a textile factory could present. She completed the impossible assignments not just on time, but with quality that exceeded anything the facility had produced before. Catherine Walsh observed the escalating situation with growing concern and curiosity. As a former military officer, she recognized the signs of someone operating under hostile supervision while maintaining professional standards through sheer discipline. But she also noticed that Rachel's responses to pressure revealed capabilities that went far beyond what any civilian contractor should possess. During a particularly stressful week, Catherine had watched Rachel work through a complex modification of tactical vest designs, while simultaneously training 2 new employees on advanced stitching techniques. A seamless multitasking, the clear instructional ability, and the calm demeanor under pressure were characteristics Catherine associated with experienced military, non-commissioned officers. The breaking point in the escalating pressure campaign came when a critical deadline threatened the facility's reputation with its most important client. A major defense contractor had ordered a specialized run of tactical gear with specifications that pushed the limits of Hartwell's capabilities. The contract included penalty clauses for late delivery that could cost the company hundreds of thousands of dollars. Marcus had distributed the work among his most experienced workers, but the complexity of the requirements quickly overwhelmed the team. Stitching techniques that looked simple on paper proved nearly impossible to execute with the precision demanded by military specifications. By Wednesday of the deadline week, it was clear that the project was failing. "We need to contact the Client and negotiate an extension, James Patterson suggested during an emergency meeting. There's no way we can meet these specifications with our current capabilities. Catherine studied the project requirements, noting the technical complexity that had defeated her most experienced workers. But she also remembered Rachel's analysis of the ballistic vest crisis and the expertise she'd demonstrated in solving problems that had stumped everyone else. "What about Rachel Blackwood?" she asked. "Has anyone consulted her about these technical challenges?" Marcus bristled at the suggestion. "She's a civilian contractor, not a technical specialist. This project requires our most qualified personnel. Your most qualified personnel are currently failing to meet the requirements," Catherine pointed out. "Maybe it's time to try a different approach." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. Rachel stood in the doorway, holding a folder of documents. She'd been working late again, trying to complete her regular assignments, while Marcus piled additional tasks on her schedule. "Excuse me," she said quietly. "I couldn't help but overhear the discussion about the tactical gear project. I think I might be able to help." Marcus started to object, but Catherine held up a hand. "What do you have in mind, Rachel?" Rachel opened her folder, revealing detailed technical drawings and modification suggestions for the problematic gear designs. She'd been studying the project specifications during her breaks, analyzing the technical challenges that were defeating the other workers. "The primary issue is that the current approach treats each component as an independent element," she explained. "But tactical gear functions as an integrated system. The stitching patterns need to accommodate dynamic stress loads that change based on how different components interact under field conditions." She spread her drawings across the conference table, showing modification suggestions that addressed every technical challenge the project team had encountered. The documentation was comprehensive, professional, and demonstrated understanding of tactical gear applications that went far beyond textile manufacturing. Patterson studied the drawings with obvious amazement. "This is incredibly sophisticated analysis. How did you develop these solutions?" Rachel hesitated, aware that her answer would determine how much of her background she'd have to reveal. "I spent time researching military equipment applications. The principles aren't that different from other precision manufacturing challenges." But Catherine wasn't buying the research explanation. The level of detail in Rachel's analysis, the specific knowledge of field applications, and the practical modifications she suggested indicated hands-on experience with tactical equipment in real-world situations. "These modifications would solve all our technical problems," Patterson continued. "Can you implement them?" "Yes," Rachel replied simply. "But I'd need to work directly with the production team and modify some of our current procedures." Marcus realized that his campaign to marginalize Rachel had backfired spectacularly. Instead of forcing her to quit or accept permanent subjugation, he'd created conditions that highlighted her superior capabilities. Worse, his resistance to utilizing her expertise was now threatening a major contract that could affect everyone's job security. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But I want detailed documentation of every modification, and all changes go through proper approval channels." Catherine nodded agreement, but she was already planning a private conversation with Rachel about her background. The technical expertise Rachel had displayed couldn't be explained by casual research or lucky guessing. This was knowledge gained through extensive training and practical experience, and Catherine intended to find out exactly where Rachel had acquired it. As the meeting concluded, Rachel felt the familiar weight of visibility pressing down on her shoulders. 7 months of careful anonymity were dissolving under the pressure of circumstances that demanded her expertise. She'd managed to maintain her cover through the ballistic vest crisis, but this new project would require sustained demonstration of capabilities that would be impossible to explain away. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the choice isn't between safety and danger, Rachel. Sometimes it's between hiding your light and letting it shine when people need it most. The moment was approaching when she'd have to decide whether protecting her anonymity was worth more than using her skills to serve others. Marcus Donovan thought he was winning a war of attrition against an overconfident civilian contractor. What he didn't realize was that he was systematically dismantling the defenses of someone whose true capabilities would soon shock everyone at Hartwell Defense Textiles. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Catherine Walsh made the call that would change everything on a Thursday evening, after most of the production staff had gone home. She sat in her office, staring at Rachel's technical drawings spread across her desk, knowing that the level of expertise displayed couldn't be explained by casual research or natural talent. This was military-grade knowledge, and Catherine intended to find out exactly how Rachel had acquired it. The first call went to her former colleague at Peterson Air Force Base, Colonel James Mitchell, who now worked in personnel records. "Jim, I need a favor. I've got an employee whose background doesn't match her capabilities. Rachel Blackwood, civilian contractor, but she's demonstrating expertise that suggests military training." "What kind of expertise?" Mitchell asked. "Ballistics, tactical gear design, material science for protective equipment." She analyzed a failed ballistic vest contract and provided solutions that our engineers couldn't develop. "This isn't hobbyist knowledge, Jim. This is professional-level understanding." Mitchell was quiet for a moment. "I'll run her through the database. Former military personnel don't always list their service history on civilian job applications, especially if they separated under difficult circumstances." The answer came back within an hour, and it hit Catherine like a physical blow. "Rachel Blackwood, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, Military Occupational Specialty 91F, Small Arms Artillery. Repairer. Daughter of Staff Sergeant William Blackwood, posthumous Medal of Honor recipient. Service record: exemplary until abrupt discharge following family tragedy. Current status: honorable discharge, full benefits declined." Catherine stared at the service record, pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Rachel wasn't a civilian contractor with unusual knowledge. She was a trained Army ordnance specialist whose father had been one of the most legendary weapons experts in military history. The quiet seamstress who'd endured 7 months of harassment was actually more qualified to evaluate military equipment than anyone else at the facility. Staff Sergeant William Blackwood's record read like military legend. Medal of Honor for actions in Afghanistan, where he'd single-handedly disabled an enemy weapons cache while under heavy fire, saving an entire forward operating base from destruction. Master-level certifications in weapon systems, explosives handling, and tactical equipment maintenance. Instructor qualifications for special operations units. The kind of soldier other soldiers told stories about with reverence and awe. But the most telling detail was in Rachel's own service record. She'd been trained directly by her father from age 14, received advanced military education in weapon systems and ordnance handling, and had been fast-tracked for promotion to Sergeant First Class when William Blackwood's death had derailed her military career. Her discharge wasn't due to performance issues, it was grief-related. Separation following family trauma. Catherine picked up her phone and called Rachel directly. "Rachel, this is Catherine Walsh. I need to see you in my office tomorrow morning before shift starts. We need to have a conversation about your background." Rachel's voice was quiet when she responded, "Yes, ma'am, I understand." The next morning, Rachel arrived at Catherine's office at 6 a.m., 30 minutes before her shift started. She wore her usual plain work clothes, but Catherine now saw the military bearing that had always been there, the straight posture, the respectful attention, the controlled movements of someone trained for precision under pressure. "Staff Sergeant Blackwood," Catherine said quietly, using Rachel's former rank. Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Rachel sat down carefully, her hands folded in her lap. For 7 months, she'd successfully avoided this conversation, but she'd always known it might eventually come. Because I wanted to be judged by my work, not my background. And because sometimes people treat military expertise differently when it comes from a woman. Catherine studied Rachel's service record. "Your father was William Blackwood, the William Blackwood." "Yes, ma'am." Rachel's voice carried a mixture of pride and pain. "He trained me from the time I was old enough to understand. That precision could mean the difference between life and death. Everything I know about weapons systems, tactical equipment, and military applications came from him." "He was killed in Afghanistan in 2018, Catherine continued, reading from the file. "You discharged 6 months later." Rachel nodded, the memory still sharp after 6 years. "He was training Afghan National Army personnel on explosive ordnance disposal. There was an accident with a defective device. 3 soldiers died, including my father. I couldn't continue serving after that. Every day reminded me of what I'd lost." Catherine began to understand the depth of what Rachel had been carrying. She wasn't just a skilled worker hiding her background. She was the daughter of a military legend, trained to his exacting standards, dealing with the trauma of losing the person who'd shaped her entire understanding of service and excellence. "Why textiles?" Catherine asked. "With your qualifications, you could have worked anywhere in the defense industry." "Because I wanted something connected to military service without being military service," Rachel replied. "I needed to contribute to protecting soldiers without being in uniform myself. Making protective gear felt like a way to honor my father's memory, while maintaining some distance from the world that had taken him from me." Catherine looked at the technical drawings Rachel had produced, understanding now why they were so sophisticated. "Your analysis of the ballistic vest failure, the tactical gear modifications, this isn't research. This is expertise gained through years of training with one of the Army's finest." "My father believed that understanding equipment could save lives," Rachel said. "He taught me to see every piece of gear as a system, to understand how different components interact under stress, to identify failure points before they became fatal flaws. When I saw those vests failing inspection, I couldn't ignore what I knew could fix them." Catherine studied Rachel with new respect. "Marcus has been treating you like an incompetent civilian contractor for 7 months. How did you tolerate that level of harassment?" Rachel managed a small smile. "Military training teaches patience and endurance. My father used to say that proving yourself to people who don't want to see your value is just another form of mission accomplishment. Besides, I've dealt with much worse supervisors than Marcus Donovan. Why reveal your capabilities now? You could have continued flying under the radar." "Because hiding expertise when people need it is selfish," Rachel replied. "My father didn't train me to be comfortable or safe. He trained me to serve others when my skills could make a difference. The ballistic vest crisis, the tactical gear project, these aren't just business problems. They're situations where my knowledge could help protect soldiers in the field." Catherine realized she was looking at someone who embodied the best aspects of military service: technical excellence, selfless dedication, and the courage to act when circumstances demanded it. Rachel had spent 7 months enduring harassment while quietly contributing to work that would protect American service members, motivated not by recognition but by a sense of duty inherited from her legendary father. "What do you want me to do with this information?" Catherine asked. "Whatever you think is best for the company and the mission," Rachel replied. "I'm not asking for special treatment or recognition. I just want to continue doing work that matters." Catherine made her decision. "Tomorrow morning, we're having a facility-wide meeting about the new tactical gear project. I want you to lead the technical presentation. It's time everyone understood exactly who's been working alongside them for the past 7 months." Rachel felt a familiar weight settling on her shoulders, the responsibility that came with visibility. the burden of living up to her father's legacy in public rather than private. But she also felt a sense of relief. After 7 months of hiding her true capabilities, she was finally going to be able to serve openly. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "I won't let you down." As Rachel left the office, Catherine sat back in her chair, thinking about the remarkable person who'd been quietly working under their noses. Staff Sergeant Rachel Blackwood, daughter of a Medal of Honor recipient, trained by one of the Army's finest, had spent 7 months proving herself worthy of her father's legacy through patient excellence and selfless service. Marcus Donovan had no idea what storm was about to break over his systematic underestimation of the woman he'd been calling Stitches for 7 months. The facility-wide meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. Friday morning, but Rachel arrived at 6:30 to prepare. She stood in the empty conference room, looking at the presentation materials Catherine had requested her to prepare, feeling the familiar pre-mission tension that had once preceded military briefings. Today would end 7 months of anonymity and force her to stand before her colleagues as Staff Sergeant Rachel Blackwood, daughter of a legend, rather than the invisible seamstress they'd grown accustomed to dismissing. Catherine arrived shortly after carrying coffee and wearing the expression of someone about to drop a bombshell on unsuspecting personnel. "How are you feeling about this, Rachel?" "Like I'm about to jump out of an airplane without knowing if my parachute will open," Rachel replied honestly. "But my father taught me that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what needs to be done despite being scared." The conference room began filling at 7:45. Marcus arrived with his usual swagger, clearly expecting another routine meeting about production quotas and quality metrics. He noticed Rachel standing at the front of the room with presentation materials and frowned. "What's Stitches doing up there?" He muttered to James Patterson. "This is supposed to be a management briefing." David Kim and the other production workers filed in, curious about the unusual all-hands meeting. Nina Vasquez spotted Rachel at the front and whispered to Brandon Park, "Why is Rachel giving a presentation? She's never been in a management meeting before." At exactly 8 a.m., Catherine called the meeting to order. "Good morning, everyone. Today's meeting is about the tactical gear project that's been causing us difficulties. But more importantly, it's about recognizing expertise that's been hiding in plain sight for 7 months. She gestured toward Rachel. "I'd like you all to meet Staff Sergeant Rachel Blackwood, United States Army, Military Occupational Specialty 91, F Small Arms and Artillery Repairer. Daughter of Staff Sergeant William Blackwood, Medal of Honor recipient, and one of the finest weapons experts in military history." The silence in the conference room was deafening. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he realized the implications of what Catherine had just revealed. The woman he'd been systematically harassing for 7 months wasn't a civilian contractor with delusions of competence. She was a trained military specialist whose qualifications exceeded those of everyone else in the facility. David Kim stared at Rachel with open amazement. "You're military? But you never said anything." "That was intentional," Rachel replied calmly. "I wanted to be judged by my work, not my background. And I've learned that sometimes expertise is received differently when it comes from unexpected sources." Her words carried a subtle edge that made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat. Every dismissive comment, every condescending order, every instance of harassment over the past 7 months was now recontextualized. He hadn't been managing an incompetent civilian. He'd been bullying a trained soldier whose father was military royalty. Catherine continued the presentation. Staff Sergeant Blackwood's father, William Blackwood, was killed in Afghanistan in 2018 while training Afghan National Army personnel. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for actions that saved an entire forward operating base from destruction. Rachel was trained directly by him from age 14, and served with distinction until her honorable discharge following her father's death. Brandon Park raised his hand tentatively. So when you fixed all those technical problems, when you knew exactly what was wrong with the ballistic vests? That was training, Rachel confirmed. My father taught me to understand military equipment as integrated systems, to identify failure points before they became fatal flaws, and to maintain standards that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers in the field. Patterson studied Rachel with new respect. Your analysis of the tactical gear project, that wasn't research, was it? No, sir. That was practical knowledge gained through years of training and experience with similar equipment in military applications. Rachel's bearing had shifted subtly. She still spoke respectfully, but there was confidence in her voice that hadn't been there before, the assurance of someone finally able to speak from acknowledged expertise. Marcus finally found his voice, though it came out strained. Why didn't you tell us? If you had these qualifications, why let us treat you like a civilian contractor doing grunt work? Rachel's tone remained professional, but there was steel underneath. Because I wanted to earn respect through performance, not demand it through credentials. And because I learned that sometimes people need to discover competence on their own rather than having it announced to them. The implication was clear to everyone in the room. Marcus's treatment of Rachel hadn't been justified supervision. It had been systematic harassment of someone whose qualifications far exceeded his own. His enhanced oversight protocols and impossible deadlines had been applied to someone trained to work under combat conditions, where the stakes were life and death rather than production quotas. Catherine seized the moment to drive the point home. For the past 7 months, Staff Sergeant Blackwood has been quietly fixing our problems, improving our processes, and maintaining quality standards that have kept us competitive in the military contract market. Her technical expertise saved our ballistic vest contract and made our tactical gear project possible. Nina Vasquez spoke up, her voice filled with embarrassment. Rachel, I'm so sorry. We had no idea. You weren't supposed to have any idea, Rachel replied gently. I chose to work quietly because I believed results mattered more than recognition. But recent events have made it clear that hiding expertise when people need it is ultimately selfish. The room buzzed with whispered conversations as workers processed the revelation. The quiet seamstress they'd worked alongside for 7 months was actually the most qualified person in the facility to evaluate and improve their military contracts. Her patient endurance of harassment wasn't weakness, it was military discipline. Applied to civilian workplace challenges. Catherine moved to the final phase of her presentation. Effective immediately, Staff Sergeant Blackwood will be leading our Military Contracts Division as Senior Technical Specialist. Her first assignment will be completing the tactical gear project that's been causing us difficulties. Marcus's face had gone pale. His systematic campaign to marginalize Rachel had not only failed, it had been conducted against someone whose technical expertise made him look incompetent by comparison. Worse, his harassment had been witnessed by multiple personnel and documented by concerned workers who could testify to the discriminatory treatment. Furthermore, Catherine continued, we'll be implementing new policies to ensure that all personnel are evaluated based on their capabilities and contributions, rather than superficial assumptions about their backgrounds or positions. Rachel stepped forward to address the room directly. I want everyone to understand that this isn't about vindication or proving points. It's about using whatever skills we have to create the best possible protective equipment for service members who depend on our work. My father taught me that expertise carries responsibility, and I'm ready to fulfill that responsibility openly. The meeting concluded with a mixture of excitement, embarrassment, and nervous energy. Workers who had dismissed Rachel as just a seamstress were now approaching her with questions about the technical projects they'd been struggling with. David Kim asked for advice on advanced stitching techniques. Brandon Park wanted to understand ballistic requirements better, but Marcus Donovan sat frozen in his chair, watching his authority and credibility crumble as people sought guidance from the woman he'd spent 7 months calling Stitches. The harassment campaign that was supposed to establish his dominance had instead revealed his own inadequacy when measured against real expertise. As the room emptied, Catherine approached Rachel with a schedule of meetings with defense contractors and technical specifications for upcoming projects. "Are you ready for this level of visibility and responsibility?" Rachel looked at her father's photo, which she'd brought to the meeting for strength. "He always said that hiding your light doesn't serve anyone. I'm ready to let it shine." The quiet war at Hartwell Defense Textiles was about to become something much more public, and Marcus Donovan was about to learn exactly what it meant to underestimate a soldier. The crisis that would test everything Rachel had revealed came just 3 days after the facility-wide meeting. Monday morning brought news that would send shockwaves through Hartwell Defense Textiles and create the perfect storm for Rachel to demonstrate capabilities that went far beyond technical knowledge and engineering expertise. Eleanor Hartwell, the company's founder and CEO, arrived at the facility with an entourage of Pentagon officials and defense contractors. At 72, Eleanor had built her textile empire through a combination of business acumen and an unwavering commitment to supporting American military personnel. Her unannounced visit meant either extraordinary opportunity or catastrophic crisis. Catherine received the call at 7:15 a.m. "Mrs. Hartwell is in the parking lot with a delegation from the Department of Defense," her secretary reported nervously. "They're requesting an immediate facility inspection and capability demonstration." "What kind of demonstration?" Catherine asked, though she suspected the answer would be challenging. "They want to evaluate our rapid response capabilities for emergency military contracts. Something about a classified situation requiring immediate equipment modifications." Rachel was already at her workstation when Catherine found her, reviewing technical specifications for the tactical gear project she'd inherited. The transformation in her bearing since the revelation was remarkable. She moved with the confidence of someone finally able to operate at full capability rather than hiding behind careful anonymity. "Rachel, we have a situation," Catherine said quietly. "Mrs. Hartwell is here with Pentagon officials. They want a demonstration of our technical capabilities, and I have a feeling they're going to test limits we've never been pushed to before." Rachel looked up from her work, and Catherine saw something shift in her expression. This wasn't concern. This was the alert focus of someone trained to perform under pressure. "What kind of demonstration?" Before Catherine could answer, Eleanor Hartwell swept into the production area with her delegation. At 72, she commanded attention through sheer presence, silver hair perfectly styled, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. "Ms. Walsh," Eleanor said briskly, "I need to speak with your senior technical staff immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate evaluation of your facility's capabilities." The delegation included Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Pentagon's Rapid Acquisition Division, Dr. Robert Chun from Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and Marcus Stevens, Senior Procurement Officer for Special Operations Command. These weren't routine inspectors, they were the people who handled the military's most urgent and specialized requirements. "Ma'am," Catherine replied, "I'd like you to meet our senior technical specialist, Staff Sergeant Rachel Blackwood." Eleanor's eyes sharpened as she studied Rachel. "Blackwood? You're William Blackwood's daughter?" "Yes, ma'am," Rachel replied, standing at respectful attention. "He spoke of you often. You provided equipment support for his unit in Afghanistan. Your father was the finest soldier I ever had the privilege of supporting," Eleanor said with obvious emotion. "His loss was devastating to everyone who knew him." "I had no idea you were working here." Colonel Martinez stepped forward. "We have," An urgent situation that requires rapid prototype development and testing of specialized tactical equipment. Our usual contractors estimate 6 weeks for development. We need it in 6 hours. The challenge was unprecedented. Rachel could see the technical specifications Colonel Martinez was holding, and she recognized the complexity immediately. This wasn't routine equipment modification. This was advanced tactical gear requiring precision manufacturing, ballistic testing, and integration with existing military systems. What specific capabilities are you looking for? Rachel asked, her military training automatically engaging with the problem. Dr. Chun opened a classified briefing folder. Rapid Assembly Tactical Kit for Specialized Operations. Must integrate weapons mounting systems, communication equipment, and protective elements in a single deployable package. Assembly time must be under 10 seconds for field deployment. Rachel studied the specifications, her mind immediately cataloging the technical challenges. This was exactly the kind of problem her father had trained her to solve: complex integration of multiple systems under extreme time pressure with zero tolerance for failure. The assembly requirement is the critical factor, she said after reviewing the specifications. Everything else is engineering materials, mounting points, load, distribution. But field assembly under combat conditions requires intuitive design and muscle memory integration. Marcus Donovan, who had been hovering at the edge of the conversation, spoke up. "Ma'am, this seems beyond our facility's capabilities. Maybe we should recommend a specialized defense contractor with more advanced equipment." Eleanor turned to look at Marcus with the expression of someone identifying an obstacle. "And you are?" "Marcus Donovan, floor supervisor. I've been overseeing operations here for. Your recommendations are noted." Eleanor interrupted coolly, then turned back to Rachel. "What do you think, Staff Sergeant? Can this be done?" Rachel felt the familiar calm that preceded her most challenging missions. This was why her father had trained her so intensively, not just for routine maintenance, but for moments when impossible requirements demanded innovative solutions. "Yes, ma'am. But not through conventional manufacturing approaches. This requires understanding how soldiers actually interact with equipment under stress, how muscle memory affects assembly sequences, and how to optimize component design for rapid deployment." She paused, knowing that her next words would commit her to a demonstration that would either validate everything she'd claimed or expose her as overconfident. "I can prototype the assembly system and demonstrate field deployment capabilities, but I'll need access to standard military weapons and equipment for integration testing." Colonel Martinez exchanged glances with Dr. Chun. This was exactly what they'd hoped to find. Not just manufacturing capability, but tactical understanding of how equipment functioned in real-world applications. "What do you need?" Colonel Martinez asked. Rachel looked around the production floor, mentally cataloging available materials and equipment. Standard M4 carbine platform, basic tactical gear components, and 6 hours of uninterrupted work time. "I'll need to modify existing patterns and create new assembly protocols. And for demonstration purposes?" Dr. Chun asked. Rachel met his gaze directly. "I'll assemble the complete tactical kit from component pieces in under 4 seconds. Full weapons integration, all systems functional, ready for immediate deployment." The silence that followed was profound. Even Marcus, who had spent 7 months dismissing Rachel's capabilities, understood that she'd just committed to something that would either be spectacular or catastrophic. Eleanor Hartwell smiled for the first time since arriving. "Your father would be proud, Rachel. He always said that the difference between possible and impossible was usually just a matter of proper preparation and timing." "Ma'am," Rachel replied, "he also taught me that some challenges are too important to approach with anything less than total commitment. If American soldiers need this equipment, then it will work exactly as promised." Colonel Martinez nodded approvingly. "You have 6 hours, Staff Sergeant. Show us what William Blackwood's daughter can do." As the delegation moved to observe from A safe distance, Rachel began the most important work of her career. Everything her father had taught her, every skill she'd developed, every lesson learned through years of training and military service, would be tested in the next 6 hours. Marcus Donovan watched from the sidelines, finally understanding that he'd spent 7 months harassing someone whose capabilities exceeded anything he'd ever encountered. The woman he'd called Stitches was about to demonstrate why Staff Sergeant William Blackwood had been a legend, and why his daughter carried that legacy in her skilled hands. The countdown to the impossible demonstration had begun. The 6 hours that followed would be remembered at Hartwell Defense Textiles as the day everything changed. Rachel worked with the focused intensity of someone whose father had trained her for exactly this kind of impossible challenge. She converted the main production floor into a rapid prototyping center, requisitioned materials from every department, and began creating something that had never existed before. Eleanor, Hartwell, and the Pentagon delegation established an observation area where they could monitor progress without interfering. Word had spread through the facility that something extraordinary was happening, and workers found excuses to pass by the production floor to watch Rachel work. Even employees from other shifts had come in to witness what many were calling either a miracle in progress or a disaster waiting to happen. Rachel's approach was methodical but revolutionary. Instead of starting with traditional manufacturing processes, she began by analyzing how soldiers actually moved under combat stress. She studied muscle memory patterns, grip positions, and the biomechanics of rapid equipment deployment. Her father had taught her that the best equipment worked with human instincts rather than against them. "She's not just designing gear, David," Kim whispered to Brandon Park as they watched from a distance. "She's designing how humans interact with gear." The first 3 hours were spent creating what Rachel called intuitive assembly protocols. Every component had to be designed so that soldiers could assemble the kit correctly, even in darkness, under stress, or while wearing gloves. The shapes, textures, and connection points were engineered to guide proper assembly through touch alone. Dr. Shun observed Rachel's work with growing amazement. "She's solving integration problems that our best engineers struggle with for months. And she's doing it while simultaneously manufacturing the components." Rachel's military training showed in every aspect of her process. She tested each component under simulated stress conditions, verified that every connection point could withstand combat loads, and ensured that the assembled kit would function reliably in the field. Her quality standards weren't just about meeting specifications, they were about equipment that could save lives. Catherine Walsh watched the demonstration with a mixture of pride and amazement. 7 months ago, Rachel had arrived as a civilian contractor seeking quiet work. Now she was solving problems that the Pentagon's best specialists couldn't address. Working under pressure that would have broken most people, Marcus Donovan stood at the edge of the observation area, watching the woman he'd called Stitches perform at a level he'd never imagined possible. Every dismissive comment, every condescending order, every instance of harassment over the past 7 months now looked not just unprofessional, but tragically stupid. He'd been systematically undermining someone whose capabilities exceeded those of anyone else at the facility. As the 4th hour passed, Rachel began the integration phase, connecting weapons mounting systems with communication equipment and protective elements. This was where her father's training became most apparent. She worked with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd handled military equipment thousands of times, understanding not just how components functioned individually, but how they worked together as integrated systems. "Mounting points have to accommodate different weapons platforms," she explained to Colonel Martinez during a brief break. "But they also have to maintain structural integrity under recoil forces while allowing rapid reconfiguration for different mission requirements." Colonel Martinez studied Rachel's work with professional respect. Most contractors focus on individual components. "You're thinking about the complete operational system." My father taught me that equipment failure in combat isn't just about broken parts, Rachel replied. It's usually about how different components interact under conditions they weren't designed to handle. The 5th hour brought the first complete prototype. Rachel assembled the kit from component pieces, testing every connection, verifying every function, ensuring that the assembled system met all specified requirements. The result was elegant in its simplicity, a tactical kit that integrated multiple complex systems into a package that could be deployed rapidly and reliably. But the real test was still coming. Rachel had promised 4-second assembly from component pieces, and that demonstration would either validate everything she'd accomplished or expose fatal flaws in her design. Nina Vasquez watched Rachel prepare for the final demonstration with obvious admiration. I can't believe we worked next to her for 7 months without knowing what she could do. She didn't want us to know, Brandon Park replied. That makes it even more impressive. She was helping all of us while hiding capabilities that could have gotten her promoted anywhere. As the 6th hour approached, Rachel made final adjustments to the assembly system. She'd created color-coded connection points, textured grip surfaces, and intuitive component shapes that would guide proper assembly even under extreme stress. Every element had been tested and refined based on her understanding of how soldiers actually functioned in combat situations. Eleanor, Hartwell approached Rachel as the final preparations concluded. Your father would be incredibly proud of what you've accomplished today. This isn't just exceptional engineering, it's innovation that will save lives. Thank you, ma'am, Rachel replied. He always said that the best way to honor fallen soldiers was to create better protection for those still serving. The formal demonstration began at 2 p.m. Pentagon officials, defense contractors, facility managers, and production workers gathered to witness something that most considered impossible. Rachel stood at a preparation table where tactical kit components had been laid out in random positions, the same way equipment might be scattered during combat resupply operations. Colonel Martinez held a digital timer. 4 seconds, Staff Sergeant. Full tactical kit assembly, all systems functional, ready for immediate deployment. Rachel looked at the scattered components, her mind automatically cataloging positions and calculating optimal assembly sequences. This was the moment her father had been preparing her for throughout their years together, the chance to demonstrate that proper training and innovative thinking could overcome any technical challenge. Ready when you are, Colonel, she said calmly. Mark! Rachel's hands moved with precision that seemed to defy physics. Component pieces flowed together with the fluid efficiency of someone whose muscle memory had been trained for exactly this sequence. Weapons mounting systems clicked into place, communication equipment integrated seamlessly, protective elements aligned perfectly. The digital timer showed 3.7 seconds when Rachel stepped back from the fully assembled tactical kit. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Eleanor Hartwell began applauding, followed by Colonel Martinez, Dr. Chun, and everyone else present. The impossible had become reality through the skilled hands of William Blackwood's daughter. Unbelievable, Dr. Chun breathed. That's faster than our best special operations personnel can assemble standard equipment. Rachel tested the assembled kit one final time, verifying that every system functioned correctly and that the equipment was ready for immediate deployment. All systems operational, sir, ready for field use. Eleanor turned to address the gathered personnel. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed something remarkable. Staff Sergeant Blackwood hasn't just met our requirements. She's exceeded them while demonstrating capabilities that will revolutionize how we approach tactical equipment development. Marcus Donovan stood frozen at the back of the group, finally understanding the magnitude of his mistakes. The woman he'd systematically harassed for 7 months had just performed a demonstration that would be talked about in military procurement circles for years to come. Rachel had proven that William Blackwood's legacy lived on in the skilled hands and brilliant mind of his daughter. The impossible had become possible through 7 months of patient preparation and a lifetime of training for exactly this moment. The immediate aftermath of Rachel's demonstration was electric with possibility and consequence. Eleanor Hartwell pulled Colonel Martinez and Dr. Chun aside for an urgent conversation while facility workers buzzed with excitement about what they'd witnessed. But for Rachel, the most important moment came when she looked across the production floor and saw her colleagues, people who'd worked beside her for 7 months, finally understanding who had been quietly serving alongside them. David Kim was the first to approach her, his expression mixing awe with embarrassment. "Rachel, we had no idea. All those times you helped me with technical problems, all the suggestions you made that we didn't take seriously. You weren't supposed to know," Rachel replied gently. "I chose to work quietly because I believed results mattered more than recognition. But today showed me that sometimes hiding expertise when people need it is actually selfish." Eleanor Hartwell returned from her conference with the Pentagon delegation, her expression radiating the satisfaction of someone who just secured a transformational opportunity. "Staff Sergeant Blackwood, I've just negotiated a new contract with the Department of Defense. They want you to lead development of next-generation tactical systems for special operations units. The offer was extraordinary, essentially unlimited resources, direct Pentagon support, and the opportunity to revolutionize military equipment development. But more importantly for Rachel, it represented the chance to honor her father's memory by creating protection systems that could save countless lives." "Ma'am, I'm honored by the offer," Rachel said carefully. "But I have conditions." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Conditions?" "I want to maintain my base here at Hartwell, working with the people who've supported me. This facility has capabilities that larger defense contractors lack: flexibility, innovation, and workers who understand that every piece of equipment might save someone's life." Eleanor smiled approvingly. "Your father always prioritized people over politics. What else?" Rachel looked toward Marcus Donovan, who stood apart from the celebrating crowd, clearly understanding that his career at Hartwell was effectively over. "I want comprehensive retraining programs for all supervisory personnel on recognizing and utilizing hidden talent. Too many good people get overlooked because they don't fit expected profiles." "Agreed," Eleanor said immediately. "What else?" "Educational opportunities for production workers who want to develop technical skills. David Kim has excellent instincts for advanced manufacturing. Nina Vasquez understands quality control better than she realizes. Brandon Park has natural engineering aptitude. People deserve chances to grow beyond their current positions." Catherine Walsh, who had been listening to the conversation, felt deep satisfaction at seeing Rachel's priorities. Even in triumph, she was thinking about how to lift others rather than just advancing herself. Colonel Martinez approached with paperwork for the new Pentagon contract. "Staff Sergeant, this assignment comes with security clearances and access to classified projects. You'll be working on equipment that could affect special operations worldwide." Rachel accepted the documents with the solemnity they deserved. "Sir, my father taught me that military service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It continues every time you use your skills to protect others." The transformation of workplace dynamics was immediate and dramatic. Workers who had dismissed Rachel as just a seamstress now sought her guidance on technical challenges they'd been struggling with for months. Production supervisors asked for her input on process improvements. Quality control personnel requested training on military specifications, but the most significant change involved Marcus Donovan. Catherine Walsh called him into a private meeting that afternoon. His personnel file and 7 months of documented harassment incidents spread across her desk. "Marcus, we need to discuss your future at this company," Catherine began. "Your treatment of Staff Sergeant Blackwood over the past 7 months was not just unprofessional, it was discriminatory harassment of our most qualified technical specialist. Marcus sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full magnitude of his mistakes. Every condescending comment, every impossible deadline, every public humiliation had been directed at someone whose capabilities exceeded his own by orders of magnitude. "I want you to understand what you cost this company," Catherine continued. "For 7 months, you prevented our most valuable employee from contributing at her full potential. You created a hostile work environment for someone whose expertise could have revolutionized our operations from day one." "I didn't know," Marcus said weakly. "You didn't know because you never bothered to learn," Catherine replied sharply. "You made assumptions based on position rather than performance, title rather than talent. That kind of leadership has no place in this organization." Marcus was terminated that afternoon, his departure witnessed by workers who understood that systemic harassment would no longer be tolerated at Hartwell Defense Textiles. The message was clear: competence and character mattered more than politics and prejudice. Rachel spent the evening in her apartment, looking at her father's photograph and processing the day's transformations. 7 months of careful anonymity had ended with public recognition that would change everything about her life and career. "I hope I made you proud today, Papa," she whispered to the photograph. "The demonstration went exactly like you taught me. Prepare thoroughly, execute flawlessly, and remember that the mission is always bigger than personal recognition." Her phone rang with the first of what would become dozens of calls from defense contractors, military units, and research institutions seeking her expertise. But Rachel's thoughts were focused on the team she'd built at Hartwell and the opportunities they'd create together. The next morning, Rachel arrived at the facility to find a transformed workplace. Eleanor Hartwell had announced company-wide policy changes based on what she called the Blackwood standard, evaluation systems focused on capability rather than credentials, promotion opportunities based on performance rather than politics, and recognition programs that celebrated quiet excellence alongside public achievement. David Kim approached her with a technical question about advanced stitching patterns, but his demeanor was different now, respectful rather than casual, recognizing that he was learning from someone whose expertise had been tested at the highest levels. "Rachel," he said, "I wanted to apologize for not taking your suggestions seriously before. I realize now that you were trying to help us improve, and we were too focused on superficial things to recognize your knowledge." "David, you were always respectful and willing to learn," Rachel replied. "That matters more than technical knowledge. Skills can be taught, but character is something people either have or they don't." Nina Vasquez joined the conversation, her expression mixing embarrassment with determination. "I want to apply for the technical training program you suggested. I've been doing basic quality control for 3 years, but I want to understand the engineering principles behind what we're testing." Rachel smiled, remembering her father's belief that education was the greatest gift one person could give another. "I'd be happy to help with your training. Understanding why things work makes you much better at identifying when they don't work." As the morning progressed, Rachel realized that her demonstration had accomplished something more important than just proving her capabilities. It had created an environment where hidden talents could emerge, where quiet contributors could be recognized, and where excellence could develop regardless of background or position. The transformation of Hartwell Defense Textiles was just beginning. But already Rachel could see the potential for something her father would have been proud of: a workplace where capability mattered more than appearance, where expertise was valued regardless of its source, and where every person had the opportunity to contribute at their highest level. Marcus Donovan's systematic harassment had inadvertently created the pressure that forced Rachel to reveal capabilities that would revolutionize the company. His attempt to marginalize her had instead elevated her to a position where she could transform opportunities for everyone. Sometimes the best revenge really was massive success achieved through patient excellence. 5 years later, Rachel Blackwood stood in the expanded facility of Hartwell Defense Textiles, watching a new generation of technical specialists work on equipment that would protect soldiers worldwide. The company had grown from a regional textile manufacturer to a premier defense contractor, but more importantly, it had become a model for recognizing and developing hidden talent in unexpected places. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Building a culture where capability mattered more than credentials required systematic changes in hiring, training, and promotion practices. But the results spoke for themselves. Hartwell now boasted some of the most innovative military equipment designs in the industry, created by teams that valued expertise regardless of its source. David Kim, now senior manufacturing engineer, approached Rachel with drawings for a new ballistic protection system. His promotion from production worker to engineering leadership exemplified the opportunities that the Blackwood standard had created throughout the organization. "Rachel, we've refined the modular armor concept based on field feedback from the 82nd Airborne," he said, spreading technical drawings across her desk. "The soldiers love the rapid reconfiguration capability, but they're requesting even faster transition between protection levels." Rachel studied the drawings with the same methodical approach her father had taught her. 5 years of leading advanced development projects had refined her skills, but the fundamental principles remained unchanged. Understand how soldiers actually work, design for real-world conditions, and never compromise functionality for convenience. "The transition mechanism is elegant," she observed, "but we can optimize the locking system for single-handed operation. Soldiers often need to reconfigure protection while maintaining weapon readiness." David made notes on the drawings, still marveling at Rachel's ability to identify practical improvements that engineers with decades of experience might miss. Her insights came from understanding equipment as integrated systems rather than individual components. Nina Vasquez, now Quality Assurance Director, joined the discussion with test results from the latest prototype evaluations. Her journey from basic production worker to department head demonstrated the power of recognizing potential in unexpected places. "Field testing confirms that the new assembly protocols work exactly as designed," Nina reported. "Average reconfiguration time is down to 12 seconds, and soldier feedback is overwhelmingly positive. They especially appreciate the intuitive design that works correctly even in darkness." Rachel smiled, remembering her father's emphasis on equipment that worked with human instincts rather than against them. "What about durability under combat conditions?" "Exceeds all specifications," Nina replied confidently. "The modular components maintain structural integrity through multiple reconfiguration cycles, and the locking mechanisms show no degradation after extended field use." The success of Hartwell's advanced equipment designs had attracted attention throughout the military procurement community. Rachel's innovations in rapid assembly systems, intuitive user interfaces, and modular protection concepts were being adopted by defense contractors worldwide. But the most important legacy wasn't technical, it was cultural. Eleanor Hartwell, now 87 but still actively involved in company leadership, had established the Blackwood Institute for Recognizing Hidden Talent. The program worked with military units, defense contractors, and civilian companies to identify and develop capabilities that traditional evaluation methods missed. "Your father would be amazed by what you've accomplished," Eleanor told Rachel during their weekly strategic meeting. "Not just the technical innovations, but the number of people whose careers you've transformed by believing in their potential." Institute had documented hundreds of cases where overlooked employees had made significant contributions once given appropriate opportunities. Former janitors had become quality control specialists. Administrative assistants had developed into project managers. Production workers had advanced to engineering positions. The common thread was recognition that competence often developed quietly, away from traditional promotional pathways. Rachel's own career had evolved beyond her expectations. She now held the title of Chief Innovation Officer and served on Eleanor Hartwell's board of directors. Her security clearances allowed her to work on classified projects that could affect special operations worldwide. But she insisted on maintaining her connection to the production floor, working directly with the teams that transformed her designs into reality. Brandon Park, now Director of Advanced Manufacturing, had become one of Rachel's most trusted collaborators. His natural engineering aptitude, combined with formal training opportunities that the Blackwood standard had provided, had made him an expert in precision manufacturing techniques. The Pentagon wants to expand the rapid assembly concept to crew-served weapon systems, Brandon reported during a project review meeting. They're talking about equipment that can be reconfigured for different missions without returning to base support. Rachel considered the implications. Crew-served weapons involve different engineering challenges, multiple operators, higher mechanical stresses, more complex integration requirements. But the fundamental principles should still apply. She pulled out a notebook, the same type her father had used to record technical observations, and began sketching conceptual designs. 5 years of leading advanced projects had taught her that the most revolutionary innovations often started with simple drawings that captured essential relationships between components. The meeting was interrupted by a call from Colonel Martinez, now director of the Pentagon's Rapid Acquisition Division. Rachel's relationship with the military procurement community had evolved into something approaching legendary status, but she remained focused on practical results rather than recognition. Staff Sergeant, Colonel Martinez said, using the rank that had become Rachel's preferred title regardless of her civilian position. We've got a situation that requires your particular expertise. Can you be at Peterson Air Force Base tomorrow morning? Yes, sir, Rachel replied without hesitation. Her father had taught her that service didn't end with discharge, it continued every time. You used your skills to protect others. That evening, Rachel sat in her apartment, which had evolved into a reflection of her dual identity: technical manuals, shared shelf space with textile samples. Military commendations hung beside photos of production teams. Her father's Medal of Honor occupied a place of honor, surrounded by letters from soldiers whose lives had been saved by equipment she'd designed. A knock at her door interrupted her preparations for the next day's Pentagon assignment. David Kim stood outside, holding a wrapped package and wearing the expression of someone about to deliver significant news. "Rachel, I wanted you to be the first to know," he said, his voice mixing excitement with emotion. "And we accepted my application for graduate school, full scholarship for advanced materials engineering." Rachel felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing others achieve their potential. "David, that's wonderful news. Your father would be incredibly proud." "I couldn't have done this without the opportunities you created," David replied. "When you arrived, I was just a production worker with high school education. Now I'm going to MIT because you believed I had potential worth developing." He handed her the package. "This is for you. Something to remember that recognition works both ways." Inside was a custom challenge coin, beautifully crafted with Hartwell's logo on one side and a tactical rifle assembly on the other. The inscription read, "Blackwood Standard, Excellence in Service, Innovation in Purpose." Rachel studied the coin, thinking about her father's silver dollar that had been split and welded back together with gold. Both coins represented the same principle: broken things could be made whole, overlooked people could achieve greatness, and patient excellence would ultimately triumph over prejudice and doubt. As she prepared for the next day's classified assignment, Rachel reflected on the journey from invisible seamstress to recognized expert. The transformation hadn't been about changing who she was. It had been about finding the courage to let others see capabilities she'd always possessed. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Excellence doesn't require an audience, Rachel, but it deserves opportunity." The 7 months of invisibility at Hartwell had taught her that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was prove yourself worthy of recognition through patient contribution rather than demanding attention. Through credentials. The next morning, Rachel would travel to Peterson Air Force Base for another impossible challenge. But she would go as someone who understood that hidden talents existed everywhere, waiting for the right moment and the right opportunity to emerge. Her legacy wasn't just the equipment she'd designed or the contracts she'd won. It was the understanding that capability often came from unexpected sources, and that the person you underestimated most might be the one who saved your mission. The quiet seamstress who had been invisible for 7 months had become a voice for every overlooked person carrying hidden potential. Her story would be told for generations as proof that excellence developed in silence could ultimately speak louder than any words. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.